Thank you, everybody. This is essentially part two of our look at bias crimes and hate crimes in Oregon, and what we can do to support those people who are survivors of bias and hate crimes. Last week we had Johanna Costa with us talking about the different supports and avenues that are available for people who are reporting bias crimes, the way we track those, and the way they are supported through that process. Today, we are lucky to be joined by BJ Park, the Deputy District Attorney from Multnomah County. And, as we're doing work within community justice around equity and around our commitment to diversity and inclusion, the one thing that it continues to bring home is that it's not just a switch. It's not one piece. It's comprehensive. It's pervasive. And I think the same is for our criminal justice system. When we look at the justice outcomes we want for folks, equity really is in so many different places, in all places really. And as we look at the way these crimes are prosecuted to create a more equitable and safe Oregon, BJ, I just want to thank you again for joining us and turn the floor over to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me get share the screen for the PowerPoint that I have. I'm BJ Park. I'm a Deputy District Attorney here in Multnomah County. I just wanted to go over the statute itself, because I think that's what will answer a lot of the questions. And there's been a new law that came into being not last year, but the year before, so 2019, July. And even though it's been a year and a half, it's really important to understand both the old law and the new law. And people may wonder, well, why do I have to know about the old law when it's not here anymore? Well, because there's still cases that the statute of limitations does not run on those. And the old law still is very similar to the new law. So it would still be relevant enough. So I've tried to break it down pretty simply. So here we go. So this is the old law, which is ORS 166.165. It's formally called intimidation in the first degree, or as I call it here, intimidation 1. It was a felony. And it was simply this. So the old law had 3 different possible ways to commit this offense. The first is this. 2 or more defendants acting together, and that applies to all 3 ways. And here's the first way to commit it. 2 or more defendants acting together, intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly cause physical injury to victim. So that sounds like assault 4. But you have to have 2 or more defendants acting together because of defendant's perception of victim's race, color, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or national origin. So that's what I call the protected class of the victim. So that was the 3 elements of the first way to commit intimidation 1. Second way to commit it, and please notice the or. So it doesn't have to be both. So the second way to commit it is 2 or more defendants acting together with criminal negligence cause physical injury to the victim by means of a deadly weapon because of defendant's perception of victims, so on and so on and so on. Okay. And here is the third way to commit it, which is 2 or more defendants acting together intentionally place victim in fear of imminent serious physical injury, menacing essentially. Because of defendants, and then so on and so on. So these were the 3 possible ways to commit intimidation 1 under the old laws. There was a intimidation second, or intimidation in the second degree, intimidation 2, which was ORS 166.155, and that was a misdemeanor, Class A misdemeanor, and there were 3 possible ways to commit this offense as well. The first is tampers or interferes with property, having no right to do so or no reasonable grounds to believe that the defendant has such right, with the intent to cause substantial inconvenience to victims. This is essentially criminal mischief. Because of, and it's the same, everything else is the same here, because of defendant's perception of victims, one of these protected class, as I call it. The second way to commit intimidation 2 under the old law is intentionally subjects victim to offensive physical contact, which is essentially harassment, because of victim's defendant's perception and so on. Okay, so that the rest is the same. The third possible way to commit it is a little bit different than the menacing statute, which is intentionally subjects victim to alarm by threatening one of these two things. A, to inflict serious physical injury or commit a felony affecting the victim or a member of victim's family, so it extends to victim's family member. Or B, to cause substantial damage to the property of victim or victim's family because of, and then so on and so on and so on. So that were the three possible ways to commit the old intimidation to a misdemeanor. So here is the new law. The new law is very similar to the old law. So basically, here is the elements again of intimidation 1. So what they did was they basically took away this element of 2 or more defendants acting together. So they took that away. The other thing they did was they added gender identity. So that is the 2 changes to the new law. And the new law is now called bias crime 1 or bias crime in the first degree. It's a felony. And it's the same statute section as the old section. So this completely replaced the intimidation 1, which no longer exists, or as 166, 165. Everything else, the language is exactly the same as intimidation 1. So that's the only 2 difference, is the absence of the 2 or more defendants requirement and adding of gender identity. And gender identity, the new law has defined it as the following. An individual's gender-related identity, appearance, expression, or behavior, regardless of whether the identity, appearance, expression, or behavior differs from that associated with the genders assigned to the individual at birth. So this covered certainly misogynists as well as a transgendered victim as well. So that solved that issue, which is great. So that's that. And then with bias crime 2, same thing. Everything is the same except for adding of gender identity with that same definition. And that definition is found in the statute itself. And this is also taking place of intimidation 2. It's the same statute section as intimidation 2. Bias crime in the second degree, which is a misdemeanor. Just some quick things here. Bias crime, this bias crime new statute, it took effect on July 15th of 2019. So it is not retroactive, which means all bias crimes committed before July 15, 2019 has to be charged under the old intimidation statute. I still have on my caseload several cases where it's charged under the old intimidation statute. And they're still hanging around thanks in large part to the COVID backlog, where I don't know about other counties, but in Multnomah County, we're not really doing trials, so our caseload is just ballooning, and many of them get caught up, some of the old cases under the old intimidation statute. Proving motive. So this is the most important part. I know there's a lot of law enforcement out there, so I really want law enforcement to understand this portion. So there is a difference between intent and motive. This again sounds like lawyer word games, but in the courtroom, this actually really is critical. This is one of those like, hey, if you remember nothing from this presentation, just pay attention to this part, and then you should be good, kind of a thing. So the intent, as we use it in criminal law courtrooms, is what is the defendant trying to do with his or her actions right now? So if the defendant has a knife and is swinging it toward the victim and is approaching and says, I'm going to kill you, the intent there is to cut, stab, seriously injure, or possibly kill the victim, right? That's the intent. What is the defendant trying to do that you can figure out from his or her actions and words? The motive, on the other hand, is why is the defendant doing this? It's what is driving the victim to do this. That's the difference. So the intent is what the defendant's trying to achieve. Motive is why is the defendant doing it. Usually motive is not an issue and it's not an element. And we often argue this, like in murder. We don't have to prove why the defendant did it. We just have to prove that the defendant did it. We just know that the action is immoral and evil enough there, where and it's that the motive doesn't matter. And a lot of times it's almost impossible to prove. We have no idea why. But in these bias crime cases, we got to prove it. So that's why these bias crime or hate crime case laws around the nation are often almost impossible to prove unless you have like this priest confessional by the defendant saying, "Oh, I did that because of because I hate African Americans." I mean, they would not use that term, but that kind of a thing. So that's why those kind of crimes are often not charged. However, in Oregon, it's different. The because of requirement is what you need to pay attention to. Remember, here's the elements of the law again. You notice here, the whole thing comes down to these two words, because of. Because let's face it, these are separate crimes by itself. If you take out this second square or rectangle, these are, this is assault 4. I forgot what crime this is. I think this is a subsection of either assault 3 or something else. Anyway, I apologize. I should know that. Or this is menacing. But then when you add this element, that's what makes it the bias crime. And you notice it says because of defendant's perception of victims in the protected class. Same thing exists for the misdemeanor bias crime too, the phrase because of. So then the question becomes, well, what does that phrase mean, because of? Well, most people would think that because of means that the defendant's exclusive or only or primary motive for stabbing this victim or brandishing the knife against this victim or hitting this victim is because of the victim's race or defendant's perception of victim's race or sexual orientation or gender identity or whatever it may be. In other words, that has to be the main motivation, like 99% or even like primary, at least 51%. In other words, if the victim was white and not African American, this defendant would not have hurt this victim. That's in law we would call it, especially in civil law, a but-for test. But for the defendant's perception of victim's race, well, whatever it is, the defendant would not have committed the crime. However, that's what most lawyers or just general public jurors would think. However, that's not true. This is the part that I want people to pay attention to, the whole like, hey, if you pay attention to nothing else, this is it kind of a thing. There's a case called State versus Hendricks. It's an old case from 1991, 813 ORAP 734. This was affirmed by the Oregon Supreme Court, 314 OR 170 in 1992. Now, this specific issue was not affirmed, but basically they didn't really appeal that, and the case itself overall was affirmed. For those lawyers who are watching, if you look this up on for shepherdizing, this may come up as like, oh, there's something afterwards. But if you look up the case law, it's good law, is my point. And what the court said in this case was that basically mixed motive is okay. In other words, because of, what it really means is that it's not a but-for test, but they use the words. So what they said in State versus Hendricks is that if the defendant's perception of defendant's race, national origin, all of that stuff, religion, played, quote, any role, end quote, in the crime, then defendant's guilty of bias crime or intimidation, as it was discussing back then, but it straight transfers to the bias crimes now. In other words, if the defendant was beating up the victim because they got into a road rage thing, and then while and the defendant's white and the victim is African American, and there was a road rage incident, and the defendant is beating up the victim, and maybe says the N-word or like says like I'm gonna beat your black ass, or something like that, makes reference to the victim's race, even though the primary reason for this may be the road rage or because the victim slept with the defendant's wife or something like that. If the defendant's perception of victim's race played any role, then it doesn't matter. So the primary motivation regarding race if that is not, even if that's 1% of the incident, under Oregon law, the way State Hendricks is interpreting this statute, that person's guilty of bias crime. So that's the important thing, that it could be a mixed motive, that it does not have to be a primary or certainly exclusive motive. And it's not a but-for test. So I've gone over this with much smarter people than I, and everyone seems to come up with the same conclusion reading this case law, including I've done 3 trials, including jury trials, where we've incorporated this into the jury instructions, and the judges also have agreed and allowed this. That's just some other practical considerations for law enforcement. I know that one of the things that we've dealt with is like, I know this seems silly, but it almost seems like, hey, if you don't put it in a report, it's almost like it didn't exist in court, which obviously is not true in real life, but it does hurt us when something's not in a report. So when we started going over some of this stuff with some of the law enforcement, a lot of them have said, well, gee, I didn't know about these elements. We hear defendants say all kinds of slurs all the time. And if I would have known about this, I would have written that down in the reports. And my thing is, then write them down, please. Please write them down. And it doesn't matter if the defendant has been disrespectful to the law enforcement officer and calling the an African-American officer the N-word, or like that one case, the Latino officer, those awful slurs, write it down. It's very, very important. And you may have a bias crime whether you know it or not. So that's important to document those kind of things. And also kind of knowing some of these slurs, which I didn't know, certainly would help too. Otherwise, the officer wouldn't know to write it down. And I know that, I believe that in the last few years, we've gotten much better at, hopefully, these communities of color and marginalized communities, the vulnerable communities, trusting the police more and more to report these things, letting them know that the law enforcement absolutely cares and wants to hear from these victims, and that many of them are really surprised pleasantly when we're going forward on this kind of stuff. On behalf of them, many have said how, this kind of stuff's been happening for years. It's the first time I'm here at grand jury kind of thing.